Hello, good evening to the world today. This evening we're going to discuss the situation in Kenya. In the past we've discussed a number of other African countries. Kenya is undergoing a brief crisis at the moment. The last election was declared null and void by a court, which is unprecedented in Kenyan history because there have been worse elections than this. In previous years, including thousands of people killed, large number of people made refugees by their houses being burnt by the police, etc. With me is Nic Cheeseman, Professor of Democracy and International Development at Birmingham University, the author of numerous essays and books, who has been writing on Kenya and in the Kenyan media for some time. Nic, welcome.
Thank you very much.
Let's start with what's happening now. All the reports one reads about the Kenyan election have indicated that it was rigged, that one of the senior officers in the electoral monitoring department was actually shot dead by supposedly unknown forces, but yet something totally unprecedented has happened, that a senior court in Kenya has ruled the election illegal and has ordered a new election for the 17th of October this year. Could you explain this to us? A, Kenyan elections in general, and B, what was it that created such a crisis that a court had to intervene on, and for once on the right side?
Well, if we look, say, at the last three Kenyan elections, they've all followed a roughly similar pattern. We have had two broad coalitions, and essentially they've been two-horse races where we know really only one of two main candidates can run and win effectively. And those candidates have been on the opposition side, Raila Odinga, a long-time opposition leader, inheriting that mantle from his father, who was also a long-time opposition leader.
Oginga Odinga.
And on the other side, initially in 2007, Mwai Kibaki, and now Uhuru Kenyatta. To some extent, this cleavage is significant because it reflects the Kenyattas and the Kibakis and their Kikuyu ethnic group who have had presidents and have to some extent benefited most economically from Kenyan independence. And Odinga, a Luo, to some extent representing minority groups and people who feel that they've been historically excluded from power. And so there's a kind of haves and have-nots cleavage that maps onto those two groups that helps to explain why these elections become so contested. Now, in each of the three last elections, they have been very close contests. We haven't seen a really big margin of victory that would make it obvious one guy won by 60 or 75%. They've always been around kind of 50 to 49%, 54 to 46, very close, tight elections. And that, of course, places great pressure on the Electoral Commission to do a good job. And that's been really the weak link. In almost every election, we've seen major failings on the part of the Electoral Commission. If we go back to 2007 for a brief moment, which you mentioned in your introduction, was the cause of 1,000 deaths and hundreds of thousands of people being displaced, the head of the Electoral Commission during the counting process came out and said that he didn't really know where his returning officers were and he was worried they were cooking, as in cooking the books. In 2013, that didn't happen, but the technology used to protect the election fell apart. We were supposed to have voters being biometrically verified, so using their fingerprints to verify them as they vote, and also to have a mobile phone system to send the results in to prevent rigging. Both of those systems effectively collapsed on the day. So going into 2017, you have all of these different factors playing in. This sense of haves versus have-nots, this sense of the Electoral Commission not being able to do a good job, and the sense that it's going to be a very close election. And I think it's those three things combined that leads to this controversy. Now, the second part of your question was how do we explain why the Supreme Court has made this decision this time round, when in 2013 and 2007, the courts were basically much more silent. The Supreme Court first heard a petition in Kenya in 2013, And it was clear in that context that the process had been terrible. What wasn't fully clear was exactly what the margin of rigging or manipulation was. And what the court seemed to do in that case was to say, if we don't have evidence of systematic rigging in favour of one side that changes the will of the people, we don't rule in favour of the petition. That's a very high legal burden of proof. It's basically saying you need to prove to us beyond reasonable doubt that not only was there rigging, but the rigging changed the result.
Which is very difficult to do.
Which is almost impossible to do.
Yeah.
And especially when you consider that in the case of election petitions, you actually only have a couple of weeks to get the material together and submit. It's a very short period of time to put together a comprehensive legal case, especially when you're the opposition and you often don't get the information you request, for example, from the Electoral Commission. This time around, it looks as though the Supreme Court has used a slightly different mechanism or logic. In other words, we have a new Supreme Court with a new Chief Justice, and some of the court members appear to have either changed their minds from before or been influenced by the new members on the Supreme Court. And we seem to be basically seeing a decision which is saying that the process has to meet a certain standard, even if we don't necessarily have enough evidence to say exactly how much rigging there was. If the process deviates from the Constitution and from the legal requirements, we can say it was an illegal election and null and void on that basis. But all of that said, and this is one of the most important things, we don't yet fully know what the Supreme Court's verdict was because they haven't given us a full text of the judgment. They have 21 days to actually give us that from the date of the proceedings, and we don't yet actually have it. So while we have a summary verdict and the result...
Which is that the election is null and void.
Exactly. The full text of the justification for how they reached that, and therefore the implications for what exactly went wrong or went right in the election and what exactly needs to happen moving forwards are not yet clear to us because we don't have that text. And to some extent, until we have that text, we don't know what the implications are for the next round. Now, the Supreme Court has said that the IEBC must order a new election. The IEBC, the Electoral Commission of Kenya, has moved and said that it wants to have that date on October the 17th. So in that sense, we have at least a little bit of information. But even there, it's confused. On the one hand, if the Supreme Court comes out and actually points a finger at the Electoral Commission or senior electoral officials as being part of the problem, it seems untenable that they can preside over this election.
Next election.
At the same time, the opposition has come out and said that this election date is unacceptable. On the one hand, they say the Electoral Commission chose the date without consulting the opposition. On the other hand, they say, why not give yourself the most possible time to organise the election? So under the Kenyan law, you can have 60 days to organise that election. That's the deadline. So not only do we have the confusion of waiting for the Supreme Court's full judgment, we also have opposition and other candidates contesting the actual date of the election and who's actually going to manage this fresh election.
Nic, well, that is very clear. But let's just go back to one point you made, which is the tribal character of the division. What are the political sides of these tribal divisions? I mean, are there any basic fundamental differences between the Kenyatta clan and Odinga's successors? I mean, I recall very well when Odinga took up the fight for democracy, actually, when he first started, and more social justice and all the arguments he was putting against what he called a corrupt and complacent regime. That was the regime of Jomo Kenyatta, with whom they had been in the same organization. They'd fought for independence against the British together. They'd defended what needed to be defended in that period. And then the break came, and Odinga was put into prison by Kenyatta, as has happened in many other parts of the post-colonial world. But what seems to have taken place is that a dynastic tribal confrontation between two families What are they fighting over?
I think the first thing to say is that you're completely right to point to very strong patterns of ethnic voting and dynastic politics. So ethnicity explains a lot, but it doesn't explain everything in Kenya. In the last election, for example, at least if the results are anything to go by, and certainly if you look at how leaders distributed, we had prominent Luhya leaders on both sides of the political divide. We had prominent Kalenjin leaders on both sides of the political divide. And we could say the same thing for a couple of other communities as well. So ethnicities don't vote in a block quite as easily and simply as candidates want. And one of the things we've seen in the past is that even if the majority of an ethnic group vote for you, doesn't mean they all turn out. And getting the turnout amongst your own community can be a very difficult thing. And that means you need to not just be their ethnic leader, but a credible leader who actually says something that speaks to them. So it is ethnicity, it is dynastic, but it's also a bit more important than that. If you look from the outside, you might say that quite a lot separates them. You might say that Kenyatta is a bit more pro-business, he's a bit more maybe centre-right in his politics. You might say he's slightly more in favour of a stronger central state. And you might say that in general, he's less in favour of things like the redistribution of wealth. Odinga, on the other hand, you would say, is perhaps centre-left, or in some of his manifestations, more solidly left, that he is in favour of more of a decentralisation of power. He was a great champion of devolution, and his party historically has supported devolution, of course, one of the biggest changes to the Kenyan state since independence, and that he talks more about dealing with issues like corruption and redistributing wealth. The problem in the Kenyan context, though, is that a lot of those messages are also effective because they effectively appeal to both ethnic groups and, as it were, to certain sentiments. And so one of the things it's often quite hard to differentiate between is what is a policy difference and what is an ethnic difference and what is a difference of kind of self-interest. All of those things fuse together. But I think one of the things that is very interesting is that there are limits to what you can do with your community. So one of the things we've seen in the past is leaders who want to take their community from one party to another, flip-flopping, as it's often called in Kenya, are often punished by their supporters who say, you're no longer credible. You're using us and manipulating us to gain something for yourself, selling us to the highest bidder in order to get yourself a position. We don't benefit, and we don't believe that some of the people you're doing deals with are credible. In the 2013 election that happened to Musalia Mudavadi, the Luhya leader in Western Province, former Western Province, on the one hand he was seen to be with Raila, then he was said to have done a deal with Uhuru Kenyatta to become, as it were, the kind of acceptable face of his coalition, to be a compromise candidate they could front, because of course at the time Kenyatta and his deputy Ruto were at the ICC on charges of crimes against humanity. When that deal was then torn up, Mudavadi had to stand as an independent. Now in that election, he was the only Luhya leader standing as a sort of prominent presidential candidate, and yet he only got 3.9% of the vote. The majority of his own Luhya community voted for Raila Odinga rather than him. And that was because he'd misplayed his hand, and he was seen amongst his own community as a project or a puppet for other leaders. He wasn't seen as having credibility on his own. So I think one of the things we don't pay enough attention to in Kenyan politics is how do leaders build up that credibility. If you look at Kenyatta and Odinga, it's really interesting. Uhuru Kenyatta didn't really have that credibility 10, 15 years ago. He stood as Moi's replacement at the end of the one-party state of the KANU period, when multi-party politics had been introduced and the former president Daniel Arap Moi needed to find a successor. He went for Uhuru Kenyatta as someone who could help him revitalize his party, but also with the name recognition of a Kenyatta. And Kenyatta got destroyed in that election by an effective opposition alliance, which featured both Mwai Kibaki, who we mentioned earlier, but also Raila Odinga coming together in the National Rainbow Coalition. So Kenyatta at that point didn't have that credibility. And it was really his role in the 2007 crisis, when he was seen by many people in the Kikuyu community to have acted to defend their interests. And his prosecution on crimes against humanity was seen to be a direct result of the actions he took to protect his own communities by people within Kenya, that he rebuilt that legitimacy as a viable Kikuyu leader who could be seen as someone who was actually looking after their interests rather than, in his case, potentially a puppet for the interests of Daniel Arap Moi. On the Odinga side, his longevity in Kenyan politics is not simply the fact that he's a Luo leader, but also the fact that he's seen to have sacrificed, he's seen to have lost out narrowly and unfairly in many elections, that he campaigned for a new constitution and for devolution, which to some extent he was successful in 2010, and that he comes from this long history of a father who also did the same thing, and that he spends a lot of time cultivating that support base. And one of the interesting things about him is that he's able to mobilize support outside of his own ethnic heartlands. So I think that credibility element is really important, and we often overlook it. And that will be very important when we come to the next election.
For a minute, when you were talking about people trying to sell votes of their entire tribe or half the tribe or the sections of the tribe that they control and failing, it's sort of quite universal. This process happens in other parts of Africa. And actually, it certainly used to happen not so long ago in this country, in the Midlands, where ethnic Kashmiri leaders from Mirpur used to sell their votes to Conservatives or Labour. I mean, most voted Labour, despite what they said, but still, a lot of this went on. But to return to Kenya, effectively, you're saying that the opposition, in whatever way it represents or fights for the poor and says that something has to be done, that Kenyan society has become very polarized in many ways, that there are pro-business interests which have been running the country for a long time, backed by the West, which essentially you mean the United States and Britain, really, because I don't think the Europeans, continental Europeans, are that bothered with Africa. They backed, well, Kenyatta for a while, then they backed Arap Moi, despite the fact that he was known to be corrupt. Everyone knew it. It was under him, largely, if my memory is correct, that special police units were built, sent in to punish opposition leaders, to intimidate others. The West took this more or less lying down. They don't seem to care when it's someone who's ultra pro-business who's doing this.
I think that's right, but I think we have to sort of point out the almost inconsistencies of the West over time. I mean, as you say, when Kenyatta was in power, they sided with him and were happy with his marginalization of Raila Odinga's father, because he was seen to be too left and to be in league with Eastern powers, to potentially have contacts with the Soviets, etc. And so marginalizing him suited the UK and the US very well.
But that was the Cold War period.
That was the Cold War period. They then backed Moi, because as so often they backed continuity. But interestingly, it was international donors who got together in the early 1990s and gave Moi an ultimatum, which was, you don't get more money until we see multi-party elections. So you could say that Kenya, in a sense, was an example of international activism to push democracy in Africa. Now, of course, what then happens is that Moi is very clever and he plays the game very well. And he gives the international community just enough to get money and support, but then reneges on many of his promises, for example, for constitutional reform, rigs the elections and stays in power despite reintroducing multi-partyism. So then you move on to sort of the next era. Now, in the contemporary period, we have, again, a very complicated scenario. In some ways, shades of the Cold War have come back, because, of course, Kenya plays a central role in the war on terror. It is critical to American interests in Somalia. It is also critical to British interests. There are significant military bases of the UK, for example, in Kenya for training and so on. And so it has that greater significance. It's also, I think, and I think this is also true for countries like Sweden and France and Denmark, a very important country in East Africa, because they see it as a country that to some extent is the bellwether. If Kenya does well and becomes more stable, it exerts a stabilizing force on East Africa. If Kenya has a bad period and has ethnic violence, perhaps that exacerbates conflict elsewhere. And of course, this is a neighborhood where not too far away you have Somalia, Rwanda, Burundi, Uganda, and the Democratic Republic of Congo, a set of countries that either are or have experienced significant conflict themselves. So all of those different factors, I think, play in here. So the international community has this very complicated role where at times they're seen to be against the incumbent and at times they're seen to be for the incumbent. And a good example here would be what's happened with international election monitors. As you, I'm sure, know, their role has been incredibly controversial in Kenya. They've been accused by many Kenyans of jumping the gun. And the short story is that most of them gave initial statements that said that things looked pretty good. Most of commentators in Kenya and the media particularly then took that as a kind of rubber stamp. That meant the election was okay. Then, of course, when all of the complaints of the opposition started to become more vociferous, evidence started to mount of the problems, and we had the Supreme Court verdict that the election was illegal, the observers and monitors looked very foolish. Now, there are two bits of this story that aren't usually told. The first is that, of course, those initial statements are preliminary, and the final reports come out much later, and most of the observer teams haven't done that yet. But that, of course, does speak to the weakness of the system, because in Kenya, like in most countries, the problem is not actually the voting, it's the counting and the final announcement of the result. That's the bit you really need to watch most carefully. But the other thing people have missed in their sort of suggestion that the monitors were far too quick to side with the ruling party and say the election was okay, is that in 2007, it was the European Union observation team that actually came out very quickly and said they had evidence of fraud. They actually suggested that in constituencies like Molo and Kieni, the number that their person had seen read out at the constituency differed from the final result, and that suggested vote inflation for the president. One of the consequences of that was that after the Kenya crisis, after this violence and the people that were displaced and the political instability, some people pointed the finger at the monitors and said it was the monitors' willingness to expose the rigging that had helped contribute to the violence and trigger the conflict. So now when monitors go to Kenya, they have two things in mind. On the one hand, their mandate in attempting to do the job, perhaps also the pressure from sponsoring nations and other countries in order to try and promote stability in Kenya, but also the fear and concern about what happened in the past when election monitors perhaps spoke too early or maybe gave exactly the verdict they should have done, but nonetheless it contributed to a period of instability. And I think with all of that in mind, you can now see that it's actually quite a complicated and difficult role being an international observer.
How would you compare Kenya to Tanzania?
I think the interesting thing about these two countries is that they're often the point of comparisons because they sit so close together. They share many experiences. They were both one-party states for a long period of time, but they have these fascinating differences. I think there are two really big differences that we can trace from a long way back. And one is that in a Tanzanian context, we don't have large ethnic groups that are effective vehicles for political mobilization. And I think from the very beginning, that encouraged people to look for other ways of making political arguments and mobilizing. Whereas in Kenya, from relatively early on, from the 50s and 60s, when you start to get political parties developing, they are to some extent coalitions of different ethnic and personal votes that people have been able to mobilize around the country. I think the other thing that's really interesting is that process under President Nyerere and under TANU and then CCM as the ruling party, of educating people into a certain way of understanding politics has had a really different impact. People understand the role of the state differently, and they understand their civic responsibility differently, I think, in Tanzania and in Kenya. And as a result, you get a very different kind of political economy. But it's worth saying, of course, that the minute we see controversy in Tanzania as well. So in Kenya, we see this election controversy and this instability and the question about what will happen in the rerun, or the fresh election, as the constitution officially terms it in Kenya. In Tanzania, we see the election of a president, President Magufuli, nicknamed the bulldozer, who is pushing a number of different populist strategies. But in doing so, is actually breaking many of the rules that have so far, seemed to be relatively well respected in Tanzania, at least compared to some other African states where the rule of law is weaker.
No one ever talked, to my knowledge, of Julius Nyerere being corrupt, being in it for the money. And I was told by many Tanzanians that even when he had to make concessions to the World Bank, etc., his personal standing in the country never went down.
Well, of course, he's still seen as, the teacher. He's still revered as, in a sense, the sort of guiding star that should help the country move forwards. And Magufuli, of course, is justifying a lot of what he's doing by saying, I'm trying to deal with the corruption. I'm trying to make sure that healthcare workers get what they need to make people better, that teachers get what they need to make people better. But he's doing it in a way that often breaks down the very systems that might actually hold people to account. So, for example, instead of following exactly how the rule of law might prescribe replacing somebody who's corrupt, he might do it individually using his personal authority of the president. The problem if you do that is you often actually undermine the formal rules of the game to get what you want. And in the process, you weaken the political system as a whole. Now, if what's going to help you in the long term is actually stronger rules, people respecting the rule of law, a more effective and impartial judiciary, what you're actually doing is weakening all of that. And one consequence of that is if a leader comes in after you who basically doesn't have some of your own commitments, they can manipulate the weakness of the system to be even more corrupt, even more arbitrary, even more problematic than what came before. Magufuli is using repressive strategies to get what he wants, and that's really making people question whether or not Tanzania is on an authoritarian slide. I think the question is, even if he achieves what he wants, will he do it in a way that will weaken the Tanzanian political system for decades to come?
And let's move briefly to Uganda, which again is underreported, like much of Africa in the Western media. What is your opinion on the situation under Museveni?
Well, we have a fascinating situation. If we go back to the last election for a minute, there was a lot of discussion of whether this would all of a sudden be one of the great challenges to Museveni and his national resistance movement government. We had not only the long-term opposition leader, Kizza Besigye, who to some extent, I guess, is the sort of Ugandan Raila Odinga, but we also had a new candidate, Mbabazi, come out, who was the former right-hand man of Museveni, former prime minister, somebody who was soon to be an insider who could break away elements of Museveni's own ruling party and turn them into an effective opposition force. He was also said to have access to vast amounts of money, something which Besigye has not really had historically. And so this was said to be a real challenge. And of course, what happened in that election is that partly because of rigging, partly because of repression, partly because it turned out that Mbabazi didn't have anywhere near the kind of influence that people had imagined, Museveni once again was declared the victor with a large majority of the votes. Everybody is waiting for the moment when he steps down and then perhaps the fault lines within the government start to emerge. Now, it doesn't look like that's going to happen anytime soon. Best guess is that he's going to stand in the next election, and he may well try and stand in the election after that. But I think what a lot of people are doing, in a sense, is thinking about what's the outline and what's the playbook when he goes. Can he hand power to somebody within the government that holds it all together? Many people doubt that. If so, we're likely to see splits. And then the question is, who's the best placed leader to take advantage? And here I think someone like Besigye has a really interesting possibility. Because if you are significant as one of the main opposition leaders consistently over time, and you maintain 40% in the elections, even if you're not allowed to win them, then when the government splits, you might be the person who's best placed to pull together different elements and form a new coalition and win power. And that might be one of the reasons why he wants to stay in the game so long.
Nic, a last question. The coverage of Africa in the global media is pretty appalling, really. It's, they sometimes cover elections, or if the elections go wrong, like in Kenya, they cover disaster stories, they cover terrorist attacks, they clearly, and they used to cover wars, but even that is not happening now with any consistency. So the actual information we have from the African continent tends to be very superficial. This is something that I think started, funnily enough, after globalization. Prior to that, during the Cold War, the coverage was much, much better of what was going on in Africa. How do you explain that?
I think in the last 10 years, maybe there's a couple of really important factors. We've seen the rise of the internet and the collapse of domestic newspapers in a traditional format. And I think, many of the newspaper correspondents I know in Africa do a fantastic job. They write really good in-depth work, but there are very, very few of them because their newspapers can't afford, or at least say they can't afford, to employ sufficient people.
Well, they have other priorities.
They have other priorities. That's, I think, one of the other big changes. I mean, if you think about where are the significant theatres right now of international politics, Africa is fairly marginal. There was a lot of coverage of Africa immediately following 9/11 in terms of Somalia and so on. But where is it now? Well, places like Syria, places like Burma, Myanmar over the last few days, but also, typically the Middle East, the countries that are seen to have the greatest impact on Europe's and North America's own interests. And I guess that to some extent makes sense. That's how you sell your newspapers. But I agree it's a very sad story. I think the good thing is that it's been replaced by some excellent journalism in Africa itself. There are very good newspapers in places like Kenya and South Africa with very good domestic journalists who write really insightful stuff, and to some extent more deeper and more penetrating than it's possible for an outsider to write. And I think there's also a new spread, blogs and blogosphere, Twitter and other information that if you know where to look, you can find. But I agree with you, the problem is that a lot of that really good information doesn't get to readers in North America or Europe because they don't know where to look for it. And that's a shame because it suggests that our knowledge of Africa going forwards won't necessarily be even as strong as it was in the past, which, as you were saying, even then wasn't good enough.
Nic, thank you very much.
My pleasure.